No, and thanks for the invite to partake in it. It's I hope I'm hoping we mightn't just do a sort of a basic look at it. And you mentioned a few wee key points there, and actually your talk last week on cover crops will tie in a little bit with that and how they can impact on soil tests and soil test results. Um, so I suppose just a wee background to myself. Yeah, we've sort of did ag science in UCD, and wouldn't have said I was a great student there. But anyway, I met a couple of great people on a practical year in third year, and it encouraged me to go back and do a master's when I finished. And that sort of gave me the real passion for it. So we did a master's in soil and crop nutrition under Thomas McCabe, and in close connection with a great man called Paddy Barry. And he was the first to ever tell me in my practical year about the interaction with nutrition, and even how some of them, we'll see Muller's chart later on. And it was Paddy first told me about how nutrients can interact with each other and possibly lead to problems with uptake or an imbalance between one another. So that was, and I often make the point, and not in a bad way, I probably learned more in that month on the farm and practical experience than I had in the previous 3 years in ag in Dublin. But anyway, we developed a good understanding of how to be make friends and be social. So that wasn't a bad thing. But so that led me on then to work a wee bit in industry, and then sort of set up our own little company around soil and crop nutrition and microbiology in the main. And we were lucky to meet again good people to sort of encourage me along. So one of those was Neil Fuller, who I know has given some talks for nuts and people in the industry here over the years. We've worked with him closely ourselves, but the first time I ever met him was in a soil pit in County Carlow, and he encouraged me to go a little bit further, and which led me to people like Acres USA in America. And I often make the point, it was the organic movement that sort of really were the foundation stone of Acres USA, and it's a resource I'll mention at the end. And they kept the little flame alive with things like soil health and cover crops and rotation. So we've a lot to thank the organic sector for, which has kept ideas and concepts alive, that has probably been a big help towards keeping conventional farmers going in the last 10 to 15 years. So it's the best of the old, I suppose, and they might start to think that they have the best of the new. But from an organic point of view, we see it as a complete win-win, and we'll again touch a little bit on that later on. So then that led me to join a farmer group called Base Ireland. I think we're about 10 or 11 years in the go now. A few of us got together and set that up about 10 or 11 years ago. And that gave us sort of like that little bit of courage and confidence to talk among ourselves and maybe learn a little bit more for ourselves. And that's what we'd encourage farmers, educating farmers. And an old friend of ours who will feature in this presentation, Philip Reck, tragically passed away a few years ago. He was a big proponent of that, a big supporter of that. So I think I'd encourage any farmer to try and get involved, whether it's the local Chagas discussion group or the organics discussion group, or even just a group of like-minded friends. And sometimes it's nice to actually have a group that you're not everyone's from the one locality, and sometimes you see differences with a little bit more geography in the mix. But I think just it's very useful. So we'll keep working away on this, if that's okay, Kitty. And as I said, I'll try and knock this video off. Sorry. But so making sense of soil tests, folks. And again, feel free at the end, we can come in and ask any questions you have. I'll try and do my best to answer them. As I said, I'm hoping that I'll get people to think a little bit differently and look at this approach to soils and soil testing and soil science in a little bit of a different way. So I suppose we'd always encourage looking at a balance, and the last 60 to 80 years has been more about chemical agriculture. And you still see that a little bit even in organics, that it's about how do you put on more to grow more, even if it's non-chemical type nutrition. But thankfully in the recent past there's been a big move towards looking at the physical and the biological side of things. So that leads us on then. Look, we sort of see soil health and soil testing and in life in general and farming, it's really like a big jigsaw puzzle. There's lots of different pieces, and we just encourage people to keep trying new bits and pieces and maybe reconfigure them around the board and see what you come up with. And I suppose from a very basic point of view, and this is something that people often ask, how do we read soil tests? What do we do with soil tests? In a very simple matter of fact way, in fairness, the system was probably designed to give a low cost piece of kit to help farmers make better management decisions on farms. So the simple rule of thumb, I suppose, in not just Ireland, but definitely in Ireland, was a simple pH of 6.5, P high index 3 or index 4, and K index, again, high index 3 to index 4. And basically that crops technically should grow. You should grow good crops, whether it's grass or cereals yourselves, without much further input there, especially in organics where people mightn't have considered things like synthetic nitrogen. A slightly more complex way of looking at that then would be, I suppose, what we'd call more in-depth soil analysis. And the idea behind that then is you're not just looking at pH as a standalone, you look at things like calcium and magnesium and some of the other big cations. You're taking sulfur into account, things like organic matter, humus, micronutrients as well. Even we've tested for microbes in the past. Again, how useful that can be is debatable. We think cover crops and companion crops, understories, they have massive roles to play in recycling nutrients and actually increasing soil available nutrition over and above more applied nutrients. So our awareness thankfully increases every year. Just a little slide, again, one we've been showing for a long number of years, the soil food web. So basically that, we're all connected. When we were all at primary school, we used to sing a little song, all of God's creatures got a place in the choir. So it always reminds me of this. It's not just, soil isn't just this inert material to grow a plant. There's a lot more going on, and there's a lot of things happening above ground at soil level and below soil level to influence a successful year in farming. And again, Elaine Ingham, who worked at one stage with the USDA, I think developed most of this type of infographic herself at the time. So people might be more familiar with her coming from the compost tea school of thought. So again, we try and encourage people to nurture and nourish their soil food web as opposed to damaging or killing it. And one of the things we would see is, some in the chemical sphere, yes, chemical fertilizers can do some harm. Maybe not the way people think. If you can reduce tillage to a certain extent, that doesn't mean it has to be eliminated. Everyone has to find their own context on the farm and how to do it. You're always trying to look to maximize soil aeration. We keep emphasizing to people to avoid compaction as best they can, improve drainage. You're optimizing that calcium magnesium ratio. If that's a journey people can go on, but again, people can start with a very simple level and just basically have a look, have a pooch, testing that soil for pH. Probably one of the simplest, if people are going to test soils, it's one of the simplest metrics that can probably bring the biggest bang for buck, money invested. Looking at adding things like bacteria and fungi, again, people are now, well able to make their own on farm. There's proprietary products out there. We'd like to think, we'd encourage a lot of people to try and grow and nurture these microbes and microbiology within the soil by using plants and photosynthesis. So basically feed your bugs, looking at organic manures, plenty of fibre in manures, farmyard manure, compost, straw, molasses. Some people go on a little bit further and look at humics and seaweeds. Again, it depends on how much extraction they want to take out and how much they want to invest. And that's something that we feel a lot can be done without really spending any money bar what's in a farm and on a farm. So again, cover crops, companion crops, and that whole area of understory crops, and just try to be kind to your rhizosphere, which is that really critical level, I suppose, where the active plant roots are growing, top of the soil. So we use this little picture to say we're all interconnected, a bit like that farming system. And it was one Saturday morning collecting outside a shop for the kids' soccer and local soccer and Gaelic team, and we were there early, and there was a couple of bread lads in doing deliveries, and we just said, I suppose as farmers we do always say we feed the world, but I suppose we also need to bear in mind that there's people out there who who maybe deliver the food we produce, and especially again at early hours of the morning themselves. So look, it's just to show that we're like soils and farms and people and communities, we're all connected. So if we can keep working together and being sort of decent with each other, it's a big help. Again, very good visual from Chagas over the years on showing the importance of lime and grassland. And the reason I sort of start with this, it's probably the cheapest input that can be applied to soil to make a change to a soil test. And especially here in Ireland, we're blessed. There's a lot of calcium quarries or limestone quarries around the country, some higher in mag than others, and that's something we'll touch on later with more in-depth look at it. But again, it's just to realise that there's a constant removal to a certain extent of some of these nutrients. It depends on whether it's meat or milk or just grass, silage or crops. And the whole idea is even through rainwater and drainage, offlow. But the idea is that I suppose it depends on how we push crops. It depends on how intensive a farmer wants to be, he or she, decides to maybe push output. And it depends on how we treat crops in between, maybe growing cash crops, or how long rotations are and extraction, and maybe, more grazing versus cutting silage or hay, that actually a lot of nutrition can be cycled and we can make these soils open up a lot more. So it doesn't always have to be about applying nutrition to balance them out. But look, one excellent piece of Chagas research, and it's been on the go a long time, that if you get the pH from 6.2 up to 6.5, definitely, sorry, maybe even below 6, up to 6.3 to 6.5, you're probably making available under 80 kilos per hectare of nitrogen, and that's free biological nitrogen. So that alone is worth a lot of money, and it also, it's a very, how would you say it, environmentally friendly method of getting nitrogen into the system. There's also an improvement in P availability and uptake, basically, that without even applying any phosphorus. So we'll talk later about William Albrecht. Albrecht had already demonstrated that in some of his research working back to the 20s and 30s. There's been some data to show that potash uptake also increases once that pH and calcium levels are sort of got into nice balance, a little bit sweeter in the soil. And it's important to note, like most people just talk about lime, including some of this research. We emphasize heavily that to look at talking about lime, we need to talk about calcium as well. And really, we just on a simple level, you try and encourage farmers to fix the low cost options first, are the ones that potentially give the biggest return for the least amount of money spent. So again, just to look at some of the Irish data from Chagas, and it's really, I suppose, I think in this group here, you'll have people who look at soil tests and say, I don't really need a soil test. I'm not driving the farm. I've got a nice little equilibrium on the farm. So my soils are actually working nicely and properly, and the pH mightn't be exactly perfect, but there's a lot of oxygen in the soil. There's a lot. I'm putting in some cover crops. I'm putting in plenty of root exudates from maybe in, multi-species swards as part of a fertility building. And all of a sudden, maybe some of these figures start to sort of grow and fix themselves. And we always make that point, like a standard soil test is looking at probably 4 to 6 inches in the top acre of soil. Is if we can grow more roots, and it's one of the things we do try and encourage farmers to do on a simple basis. That's what we really should be trying to do, is grow more roots. If we can grow more roots, we can probably, some of the research is we only really explore and use 2% of that soil profile in the top 6 inches. So if we could double our root mass, all of a sudden we can find a lot more calcium, we can find a lot more P and K without changing any indices really, or maybe pH as such. So and again, we see, depending on some of the crops we grow, we can increase pH and we can decrease pH. But again, this is just, I suppose, on a simple basis, and it's probably targeted more at general purpose farming. And again, to me, in organics, it's maybe a little bit less relevant, but that's what sort of general purpose advice is from the government. So at the low P and K indexes, they do reckon, you will get a response if you're applying phosphorus in whatever form. And then as those indices rise, it's a little bit less likely that you get these responses to applied fertilizers, whether it's chemical in the conventional scene, or through maybe organics and farm manure, compost, etc. in more in the organic scene. And I suppose we see that very clearly in conventional grass systems. A lot of silage extracted, and K levels can go down in the soil. And once a farmer starts, she or he starts addressing that with a little bit more applied K, yields tend to go back up. And even a bit of sulfur with that, definitely see good responses to that. I mentioned the word SLAN, so a lot of the information on a global scale is based on a sufficiency level. So if one nutrient is high, don't apply it, and if one nutrient is low, apply that, and always look for this balance. But as I said to you, that's a very simple approach, and it does work, and it will deliver results. So it depends on the amount of effort and management and observation a farmer wants to put in. But on a very simple level, that will sort out a lot of growing problems on farm, providing the farmer, in essence, has dealt with compaction. So again, we're just looking at P and K off takes per ton of grain. Another simple way of sort of analysing when you get soil samples back. This is the type of information you get back, and it'll be targeted to say, oh, look, you know, you're at this index. You're aiming to produce an X amount of ton per hectare crop. Well, you need to be applying X, Y, and Z kilos of P and K to just match crop offtake. So if you want to keep your levels at roughly where they are, that's really the whole idea behind that type of research and advice. And again, most of the soil samples you see are fairly self-explanatory around that. But just, you know, and I think it depends on, again, I think, you know, if people are selling a lot of produce off farm and selling straw and selling cuts of silage, you're going to see some extraction away from possibly K. We are seeing on the organic type soils, the farmers that are farming more organically, not forcing yields, that even if the straw is removed, there's probably enough life in the soil to keep recycling some from the reserves. So Chagas did a great, I'd say it's gone back as far as 96, 7, 8, tillage conference, and they looked at like P and K, and take phosphorus, for example, we're probably looking at 1%. The available phosphorus on the soil analysis, so if it says 6 parts per million, that's about 1%, 1 to 2%, depending on the measurement of the actual total phosphorus in the soil. So, you know, and that's, again, that's in the top, you know, 6 inches explored by 2% of the roots. So, you know, imagine if we can grow more roots, and imagine if we can get roots to go down another 6 inches. There's a lot of juice in the tank. I think people often get afraid of mining it. I think if you take care of soils and you constantly put some level of feedback in, and that probably is better as a liquid carbon pathway, that you'll actually possibly, you won't see as big a dips in extraction. But unfortunately, high yielding crops of silage and cereal straw can remove quite a bit of potash, which can in time run down indices. So again, just touch base on that. You can see, like, even in organics, 1.5 to a 2 ton per hectare crop of or 2.5 tons per hectare, ton per acre, up to 5 tons. You're looking at 60, 70 kilos of potash there per hectare. So again, if the straw has been removed, it's quite a removal. But again, we'd see a lot of people in organics, and they're using some organic or free range poultry manure. They're using compost. They're applying some of their own farmyard manure back out, and probably, depending on the analysis of that, a couple of ton of any of those, and you have a lot of potash back into the system. So again, just the interesting here is when you start looking at when you compare, we'll say, phosphorus, grain and straw, there's not that big of a difference. And when we look at K, there is. So K, it's really the driver of straw strength, and, you know, lignin in the straw, and that's where it tends to, if we're removing the straw, it can in normal situations remove a lot of K from the system. So just to move on, I suppose, to look at a few, so basic soil analysis coming through the Irish system will again, it's probably enough information to satisfy most people. You know, again, we'd emphasize most soil test results will tell you what to do. They'll give you the results, and then they'll give you in the comment section that this is within reason. it has to be in the framework of the Irish government, so it tends to be sort of automated within the labs. So again, and there's been a push in the last few years, in fairness, to get pH up higher. There was a time when most even labs would report in the country that if you were at 6.2 or 3, it was fine. Now we're seeing, we would like to see pHs higher than that. Might interfere with somewhat allowing some nutrients into a plant, but in the main, especially on organic farms, it'll allow for more nitrogen fixation biologically, and it'll also help keep soils a little bit more open. So we tend to push it up a little. Phosphorus on that example low, potash again low. So again, you can see probably conventional cereals, 30 units, 35 units per acre of phosphorus, and over 100 units a K. Morgan's magnesium a bit on the low side. We'd see a lot of samples coming back high. We don't see that coming in through the plants. But again, a quick lime requirement. So again, you can see it's, and I did say this to Kitty before we started, like, I don't think anyone needs to be fearing understanding soil analysis. And there is, look, there's people, maybe we're all a little bit guilty of, because I'm curious and we pooch, we'll talk about that, sure. Like, we're looking for maybe a wee bit of a trend, some information to unlock a little secret door or something to another bit of learning. But in the main, there's no, I think we're all well fit to, if we're going to go to the bother of taking a soil sample, most farmers I know are well fit to take the information back and actually use it confidently themselves. But I think it leads us on then to looking at how do we maybe slightly look away from that whole basic area and making sense of soil tests. And it's to look at this idea of how we open our mind or our mindset. So I suppose we compare then the fixed versus the growth mindset. And the fixed, it's always, there is a bit of peer pressure. We do see this in agriculture. It has to look good, has to be making money. There's a lot of media comes at us, there's a lot of government, information and advice comes at us about viability. And we still think sometimes viability can be farmers being happy, as opposed to, I know we have to make a living, but I know a lot of farmers that are making a living and possibly have a part-time job, or they do something else, or they have a shed rented out on the farm, and they're quite happy because they want, ultimately their love in life is farming, whether it's beef, sheep, cereals, or potatoes or dairy, and that's the main love they have, and they want to keep doing it, and they'll do, if they have to do something else to keep them doing it, they'll do it. But I think sometimes the peer pressure can get to people, and it's always a bit sort of looking good, and then therefore don't, avoid the challenges and possibly just go with the status quo. And I think it really sort of stifles innovation. And I think a lot of farmers have to be allowed the freedom to maybe explore their own farms a little bit more and have a look at their own farms. And, I know, and it is difficult. I've been in the same position myself. Sometimes you don't want to ask the question at the meeting, or you don't want to look stupid, but there is no such thing as a stupid question. And in fact, most of the people I've met at meetings that have the courage to ask the questions, I think we've all learned a lot from them over the years. But again, if we can keep that growth mindset, that more open-mindedness, it's great. Like, it lets us sort of, take on with wee challenges. And you don't get, like, we'd encourage farmers to do on-farm trials, but maybe just don't write it off after 1 or 2 years. Have a wee pooch. That sometimes we've seen results 1 year in 3, but the 1 year in 3 would be very beneficial. And that can be rotation, that can be a different crop, it can be a different variety, it can be a species or a crop that people said won't grow well there for whatever reason. But it's just observation is the key to intelligence. Hugh Lavelle, I think, from the biodynamics section, was famously quoted as saying. But and again, it's I think people be more content if they feel that they're invested more in it themselves. So that led us, when we were young cubs here in County Louth, the older generation, if they caught you looking in the press or looking in a room you shouldn't be looking into, or for whatever reason, they tell you are pooching, don't be pooching. So we always encourage farmers, be curious, have a look, educate yourself, work with it, talk to other people. Don't be afraid to engage. Don't be afraid to ask people questions. Reach out to people. I've often gone to talks myself, and someone would say, we've worked with this guy in Australia, we've worked with that girl in America, or we did this with this. And I'd make a phone call, or I'd send an email. And sometimes it's just to verify what you're hearing, but also in other cases, it's that I find the farmers on the ground have a lot more to learning, if you know what I mean. So, and the practical, maybe the experience and how we got to that end goal. So, challenge the status quo for sure. You can think for yourself, and we'll touch base on this a little bit later on the status quo. You can think for yourself. And I think there's, probably as farmers, we've maybe given a little bit of that away over the years. And life can be busy and farming can be busy. And possibly when things got a little bit more specialized and farms started to diverge into or sort of narrow into one or two production type systems and sectors. Definitely ask lots of whys. We always say most boys will get stuck. They'll struggle with the second question, but definitely it takes a good cub or cuddy to handle question number 3 and 4, and it shows the strength of knowledge when you can ask a few more questions and delve a bit deeper, and people can answer them with confidence. So definitely walk your fields, and we joke about this, but everyone should own a spade and they should be using it. And it's people are talking more about it now, but I still don't find it much on farm. And especially with, I suppose, the people who visit farms to either give advice or sell inputs, it's still very much seen as, if I really have to, I'll take this out to impress somebody. But it's amazing what you start to see and you understand with it. And at different times of the year, soil behaves very differently. It looks very differently. You could visit a soil with a spade at a certain time of the year and say, that's beautiful soil. Come back 4, 5, 6 months later and say, what did someone do with this? They abused it. And that wouldn't have been the case, possibly. Again, just looking at a very simple thing, and it was originally, I think, in Aberystwyth in Wales, I'm not pronouncing that properly, they came up with this vest system, and it was followed up here with a joint venture between Teagasc and UCD, and developed into a very, very easy, simple sort of guideline on how to do a visual assessment of your soils. So again, that's on the Teagasc website, and a couple of other websites. UCD have it up as well. So worth a look at. We all, when we say, if you get a chance, go deeper. And we've done this on a few farms. So we've dug with a trowel, we've dug with a spade, and we've dug with diggers. And it's amazing what you see and what you start to understand a little bit better. And you start to see topsoil, you start to see roots, drainage. It's amazing. And if you go down into a pit like that and you just scrape away gently at the side, or you pour a little bit of water on the side, you'll start to open up, and you'll start to see roots going down probably a lot deeper than anyone used to believe. And unfortunately, the wee joke at the time was when they set up, there was the Department of Teagasc and a few stakeholders put up the Irish Soil Information Service. So it comes out as ISIS, but we often slag people, just try Googling that and see who knocks at the door. But anyway, and just, I suppose, to really remember, and just to just slightly take it away from soil tests, we find tests inert. So soil testing's inert. It tends to go into a lab, it's dried, it's tested, it's accurate as best it can be. But actually, soil's a living organism. And we can look at that Sloan system, sufficiency levels, and address those. We can look at build and maintain. So in some cases, the advice will be the crop's going to take off X amount of P and K or NP and K or calcium or lime, and you need to put on this much to just match that. And you also need to put on 10, 15, 20% more to keep your index at that higher level. We'd like to think that with the whole area of liquid carbon pathway and soil microbiology and living roots, that we can do a lot more than that. Treat soil with respect, and especially, you need to do your best to avoid compaction. We touched on it earlier, and it's old data, but it's French research, and especially if you're in the organic system, it's something worth looking at. And again, when we'd encourage people to do trials, don't go out and do every acre on the farm the first year and spend a lot of money. We say, look, maybe aim at a couple of percent of the land, split a field, split a couple of tram lines, get into it. You can go high level, you can work with ADAS in the UK, and they'll send in ADAS agronomics. If you have the right kit on a combine and cereals, they can take great measurements. You can hire in, Teagasc do trials. We commission trials every year with Teagasc, UCD, Donald Dilworth and Cork, Eurofins. And some of those trials officers will come to your farm and set the trial up on your farm. You could pay them to do a trial. And I think as farmer groups, it's probably something that should be looked at, more so in the conventional, because they're spending a lot of money on a lot of inputs. But again, that French research showed that the higher the pH, the higher the nitrogen fixing bacteria they were finding in the soil, and the higher the nitrogen release to the growing crops. And again, I suppose, look, maybe in the past in the organics we've looked at growing things like clover, red clover, maybe to do things like that, maybe accumulate a bit of nitrogen, or the fertility building lays ahead of a couple of cereal crops. So again, and it's just also the touch, because it's a living system, to look at soil temperature and the role of pH. So if you take something like phosphorus, you could have an index 4 phosphorus on the soil test. But if that soil is cold and wet and damp in spring, that crop's not going to respond. It's not going to grow the way it should grow. So pretty much that's not really helpful to the farmer. So we need to take into account all these interactions. pH is really interesting. If you go from 6 to 7 in pH, or 6.5 to 7, you sort of, in again, memory might let me down, but you probably reduce copper availability by a factor of 4 times. So we can fix some things, but we also need to be aware that we may imbalance other things. But it's I suppose it's every farmer's job themselves to decide, what's my biggest requirement here? What do I need? So if it's maybe a kick in nitrogen naturally, well, maybe it pays to raise the pH of the soil and ensure that that happens. And you watch out for copper deficiencies either in crops or in animals. And again, the fact most farmers in organic systems aren't forcing crops, so we don't see that as a major issue, unless somebody wants to try and add value and maybe say, look, we're selling higher nutrient value food, our crops or our meat or veg has a higher copper content or a higher iron or selenium. Well, then there's where things need to be balanced a wee bit better. So, and then we talk about soluble calcium. I think it's something that's very important. I think we don't pay enough heed to that. Something we're doing a little bit more work on the last number of years. So we look at an in-depth soil test with organic matter. And again, this is where we'd encourage farmers, if they are going down the road of testing, maybe do 1 or 2 across a farm. In the main, if we're doing soil samples for farmers, 90+% of our samples will be basic. Then we'll do some organic matter in-depth to give an idea and a trend. So it's not that it doesn't need to be done everywhere, but it just gives you a wee idea. And again, the difference then becomes, I suppose, what information are you giving yourself? That's the only, like, people have criticised whether it's in-depths on organic matters or in-depths and Albrechts or any other name of a soil sample that's out there. But really and truly, the big benefit to them is, and all they are, is that they give you more information. It's as simple as that. So again, we look at here, we have pH here of 6.8, and if we look at calcium, it's 2,467. Really, we wouldn't be, so if that was a potato farmer in our neck of the woods, we'd be slightly concerned about common scab on the potatoes, but not very, considering that it's a 16 CEC as well. So we start to get more concerned when we see that pH could be 6.8, that calcium figure could be 3,000 plus, and that CEC will be smaller. And that tells us that we've a lot more free calcium floating around to give us possibly a higher incidence of scab on the potatoes. And that's quite a negative financial outlook in most conventional potatoes. So this is something we've been encouraging farmers for a good few years to look at. Sand, silt and clay. Most labs will add it on. It's an extra cost, but I think 20 to 40 euro. Again, you don't have to do it everywhere. We'd encourage people to look at it maybe in 1 or 2 fields that they're familiar with, maybe do a couple of fields every 2 to 3 years and build it up over a period of years. Most soil sampling, if people are going to go to the trouble of soil sampling, when you break it down over an average of 3, 4, 5 years, and we'd encourage people to probably go more regular than 5. And I think even the governments now, Chagas are now even saying a little bit more regular than 5. But it's work. It's probably cents per acre. But again, that's people. You don't have to do a lot of it, but it just sometimes it's self-education. What we like about the sand, silt and clay, and this is actually a sample not far from us here in County Louth, and you wouldn't think it, but originally, like, you went back tens of thousands of years, this was part of Dundalk Bay. It's now a farm probably only 5-6 mile away from me, near Castlebellingham, still about 10 mile away from the sea. But yet when we see the amount of sand in it now, what does that really tell us? You know, and we don't have, it's a while since I've seen one as high. We see a lot of heavy ground that behaves heavy, and people call it heavy clay, and actually there's 30-40% sand in it, and there's probably 30% silt in it. So, or 30-40% silt in it. So we see this here, but the sand, so we'd be telling this farmer, there's no point trying to put a lot of nutrition out here if that's what you're going to do in one go. It won't hold it. If you are going to look at nutrition here, fine. If you're organics, you just use some sort of organic material. But if this was conventional grower, we'd be telling him, and it's cattle, it's grass for cattle. We'd be saying, listen, you need to be getting organic manures out here, because you need to be building up your organic fraction, that it'll bind that sand, at least put a bit of humus and organic matter into that sand, and then it'll hold more nutrition. But more importantly, it'll hold water, and the way we see droughts becoming a lot more problematic. And you can see in the bottom right hand corner, it goes through things like, how it'll manage and hold water, inherent fertility, because it's a low CEC. Now, it's only indicating on this one, we've measured it on the other ones. The lower the CEC, the less, it's basically like the stomach of the soil, and it can either hold or not hold much nutrition. So the higher the clay content, the higher the level of nutrition that soil can hold over a longer period of time and won't release into the environment. And again, leaching risk is higher on these sandy, light soils. And again, look, we see some growers who grow carrots on a large scale. They will do this sample because they want to know, they know themselves they will grow way straighter, which is what supermarkets sort of demand, carrots in the higher sand fraction soils. So again, it's useful for different people in different areas. But we'd find that it helps to guide farmers in how their soil will respond to applied nutrition, be it organics or non-organics. And again, we touch base, just a little example of an Albrecht, and the points I'd like to highlight here is, if you look at the pH of the soil sample, 6.6. We would have done an Irish one in Johnstown just to match that at the time, I think. 6.5, 6.6. So no need for lime. Humus content, that's 3% humus, probably 6% organic matter. That wouldn't be too bad. We'd like to see that 5% humus and 10% organic matter. And again, not a bad CEC, or total exchange capacity, he calls it here on Albrecht, 11.65. Not a very light soil. We've seen later. But again, what shows up is when you start to look at calcium, magnesium in the base, and I wouldn't get hung up on these. It's just an example of how some people look at things, and maybe try to elaborate a little bit more with soil samples. That sort of 63, 16, quite decent high levels of magnesium, and that can be fine. There's no set. Some people talk about a set ratio. We find that fluctuates depending on CEC of the soil or TEC of the soil. So not every soil has the one ratio, if that's the angle people are pursuing. But that soil is still short of calcium. So in that example, we'd have been recommending possibly gypsum, possibly granulame, and or possibly a very fine high calcium lime to deal with, because as we'll see now, we're also short of sulfur. So again, you start to look at these in-depth soil samples. That's all they're really giving you. I know people over the years have been critical of them because they said that's no need for this, no need for that. We'd have always said, look, forget about it from the point of view of trying to argue whether it's, but if nothing else, it gives you more information, and I think that's all you can run with. We've got fantastic results on grass with boron. We've got good results with cereals with boron, even though everyone told us we kill the crops. Now, you have to be careful with it, but within reason, providing the calcium in the plant is good and strong and in the soil, you'll get away with more boron. It does other things, but again, if I was starting off and I've got a budget and my pH is all over the place and my calcium's low, I wouldn't be looking at any of these trace elements. You have to just look at, get your lime right. Do you need a high calcium lime? Do you need a magnesium lime? What do you need? So a little bit more in depth will tell you that, and then tear away on that. And especially then look things like P and K and sulfur. Compost, an excellent source of, if it's allowed in organics. The same with the free range or the organic chicken manure. Some of the dairy sludges for P. I don't like even the fact that they use that term for, and it's allowed in organics. It wouldn't do much to encourage, I suppose, the thoughts about buying the food. And when you look then, I would say the boron and copper and zinc there, what you're really looking at with copper and zinc is, can we do something with disease? Can we make plants a little bit more resistant to disease? Some crops we can, some crops we can't. And again, to me, dealing with those issues are probably way down the list depending on budget and depending on what people are getting for their produce. So just briefly touching William Albrecht, Dr. Albrecht, I suppose who was he? He probably got sort of like a bad press in a way because he's given his name to a soil sample, even though he was more than just a name on a soil sample. He was the president of the Soil Society of America for, I think, a couple of terms, but he to me, he was a visionary. I've read a lot of his work. Very clever man. Very, yeah. I get the feeling he was a very honest man. I've spoken with people in America that their parents worked with him, and they always said he was very much a farmer's researcher. And if he visited a farm, he'd roll his sleeves up and get out. He'd have to get into the fields and into the crops. He would have actually toured the world giving talks on soil and crop nutrition at the time. And I suppose what I really felt with him was he was always trying to link soil health with food quality and animal and human health. And his goal was to actually put more money into farmers' pockets, that they just shouldn't be paid for basic commodities and food. They were being paid for healthy food, nutritious food. And he wrote a series of articles over many years, and it's Acres USA has its sort of shortened down into what they call the Albrecht papers. Well worth reading. Some of it's heavy, some of it's not so heavy. I found it actually not as heavy as some of the other soil textbooks in more modern days even. But he spoke a lot about balance. He spoke about humus. He looked at that calcium magnesium ratio because in parts of where he was in Missouri, magnesium was very high on the base, and you could have a pH of 7, but the soil was crying out for calcium. And you don't get that everywhere. We see a lot of that in Wexford. We don't see it in that many counties in Ireland, but it's something that was real, and he deserves credit for that. So one of his other, I suppose, really clever statements was, you need nutrients in the soil that are insoluble yet available to the plant. And if you look up some of his papers, he was proposing to the US government at the time that farmers should be getting tax relief on any inputs they're putting on farm to build soil fertility and build soil health. Like he really was way ahead of his time. So I suppose, look, just again to recap, you can, an Irish standard, and there's nothing wrong with it. But you're looking at pH, pK, magnesium, and it just summarises lime requirement, and that's fine. That'll get you a long way down the road, providing things aren't out of whack already and you're not on a very high magnesium soil, which most people tend not to be. The soil test will come back in a lot of cases saying it's high mag. We find with a lot of plants and animals that they're short of mag, and a lot of humans, and anyone that was at the NOTS conference lately, they touched base on this as well. A lot of magnesium deficiency in food in human nutrition at the moment. So again, really, whether it's an in-depth from who, it doesn't matter who it's from, and even some of the labs now, the Irish labs are starting to add these things to it. We think one of the biggest important things that should have been compulsory was organic matter, because we'll touch base on that after, and even active organic matter. So I laugh at this one, and it's taken from a very good soil science book. Scientists have simplified, so I'm not going to dwell on that, but it's probably the furthest thing from simplified as you'll get. But it was just to touch base on it. In fairness, people pH, what's pH? Oh, it's how much lime you need. It's always been parts hydrogen, and the idea there is that, and this is where Albrecht came into play initially, and the soil science reference books for Northern Europe will, and most of the world will say this. So what's pH and what affects it? Is it just lime, and then does that lead to calcium? So if you take it, and this is probably one of the reference books if you're doing ag science in any of the colleges in Ireland, this is one of the reference books that used to be any. I haven't just checked them in the last few years, but it was at one stage the main reference for a soil science course in some of the universities in Ireland. And if you go in and look at pH in this, you'll see that the international research talks about a lot more than just lime and calcium lime at that. So you're looking at connections with soil texture, CEC, calcium, magnesium, the big cations, potash and sodium, and then hydrogen and I suppose hydroxide and aluminium. So it's there. Maybe look it up and have a wee pooch and a wee read of it, because a lot of people say that's a load of nonsense, but actually it's well respected research from across the world. The value of an Irish standard, and we looked at that. Look, Wexford tillage soil, pH 6.6. The recommendation to come out: you're fine, you don't need lime, calcium sufficient, magnesium excess, P index 4, K index 4. Actually, that excess would be very high, and we'd say, why are we ignoring an excess? Is that doing something to harm us? One of the things you'll see is if you've got tight, sticky, heavy, wet soil, sometimes, you know, that can be high mag in England. Some of the old field names called the 3 and 6 horse fields. That was the idea that it took 3 and 6 horses to pull the ploughs. Heavier, higher magnesium soils that we'd even see it. If people are worried about grass weeds, sometimes that can be a problem. Um, so again, if we were looking at a more in-depth approach, maybe like an Albrecht or any of the in-depths, you're looking at pH is fine, yeah, it's 6.6 if you take the normal sort of basic look at it, but there's an imbalance between the cations, calcium deficient, magnesium excess, humus is on the low side, sulfur is very deficient, boron, copper and zinc are deficient, but again, fix the big, simple, cheaper, higher result ones first. Humus and organic matter need work. Your CEC, not bad. And I suppose when we look at actually some of the recent Chagas research that has come out um, from Johnstown Castle, they've now actually sort of started to say, yeah, we do need to start looking at the CEC, especially when we're making potash recommendations. So what Albrecht had been saying 60, 70, 80 years ago is now being more accepted. I'm not saying everyone, I'm not, you know, it's not that everything about an Albrecht test works, but I think you use things in context. Like there's loads of labs doing just a slightly more broad spectrum test. That's probably worth a look at because it'll differentiate between some of those. So just to touch base quickly on Loch Garman down in Wexford. So soil variability. This was a project we were asked to do for a group of farmers, but a local advisory merchant group wanted to look at things a little bit differently and see could they add some knowledge to the situation down there. So we went out, we were sort of said, look at this field and go and do what you do and come back in and we talk with a group of farmers some evening. So we just went into the field, broke it up into different sections just by by lane, by sight. Didn't specifically look for anything special. We could have ran machines, but we hadn't time. We were given very little notice on it. So that's 6 pictures of that field. And when you look through it, like it's very different, each of those sections. It's probably a 15, 16, 18 acre field and very different soil types across it. When we went and did the analysis on it, what we started to see was, yeah, look, 5 samples across. So we also always encourage people to take one from the hedge. Tells you a lot. So, you know, pH didn't vary much across the 5 samples, nor so in the end we did what Chagas' advice at the time was, look, you do a W sample, you walk in a W shape across your field and that's your sample. We'd have always said, look, we think there is soil variability. Funny enough, a lot of fields we see a big variability on pH and lime. In this example, we didn't, but we did in P and K, and we did in organic matter. And I think that's the most important thing to look at here. It is a tillage soil, probably in tillage 50, 60 years, definitely 40. But producing good crops, conventional, getting plenty of fertilizer, very little organics actually. But in essence, a good free draining, strong Wexford soil. But what we really like about this example is it shows us there's 100% more organic matter in the hedge than there is in the middle of the field or even in the W pattern. So it's just something to be aware of, folks. People talk about nutrition and soil tests and understanding soil tests. There's a lot of things we weren't even testing for, or the government or the agencies might, and Chagas might have said no need to test for, and we'd find it's probably a key indicator, and we'll come back to it a little bit later on as well. Now that doesn't mean we all just look, we need everything to change back to the hedge, but it makes us more conscious. Well, what can I do to get me organic matter up? You know, that's something that with the way war, you know, with the way droughts coming, you know, nitrogen availability, there's a lot of positives to organic matter. And again, from this example, we say what's driving the pH. So the magnesium is through the roof. So magnesium is driving pH. So we did look at calcium on that. And there was a couple of examples in that field that needed calcium. So again, we would have worked something like granulin or gypsum. So again, we just have to consider all of these things across the board. That's an example around the same time, funny enough, old trials in the UK, and just showing taking soil from each of those zones and growing wheat seeds in it. And you know, you start to see, well, something's happening here, folks. It's not all about NPK, whether we're organic or conventional. There's a lot more to it. And like people, we're testing for organic matter, but there's a lot of soil life in that. So when I took the samples out of the hedge, a little trial to take them, folks. It was like velvet. The soil is gorgeous. So again, this is recent work, and anyone that was at Knott's conference this year would have seen a friend of ours, David Purdy, present on this. His 5-year PhD, great research in the UK, probably as good a research as I've seen in the last definitely 20, 25 years on soil health. Again, he touched base on that whole area of VESCO. So we're looking at the hedge on the extreme. As I'm looking at the screen on my extreme left, you can even see the colour difference. Then you start to come into more like a bit of no reduced tillage or no till and cover crops, and across into tillage and no till and no cover crops. And it's just trying to improve things. So you can see infiltration rates doing very well when we can get life into soil and open up aeration and make sure there's no compaction, and bulk density scores heading in the right direction. The more organic matter and I suppose structure we can keep in soil, solid soil structure. So again, he came up with this. Well, I suppose there was other researchers looking at it as well, but in fairness, something he tied in his research, looking at the organic carbon to clay ratio, and some interesting data there. And again, when you started to get to the hedge and those good samples he showed you were probably at 1 to 6, 1 to 8. And then as you went into the middle of the field and more tillage, you were getting up to above 1 to 10, 1 to 13 and 14. And like just in the classification stage, that's probably showing degraded soils. So again, it's something to be aware of. We need to start looking at how do we get more organic carbon into these soils. And again, probably if no one has access to heavy duty organic manures with fibre in them, be straw or farmyard manure or compost or chicken manure, you're looking at growing more plants to do that job. And again, look, moving on. So again, to just compare soil tests as such, it's something we've been doing for a long number of years, variable rate soil sample mapping. We do that. This was a grass paddock, the dairy farm in County Meath, 2 acre paddock just for the cows. Big difference in pH. There's 80 kilos of nitrogen right away down there on that orange section, so we've seen that quite a lot over the time. Again, this was conductivity, which we can go into then what's underneath the ground and how it'll handle water and moisture, and again how crops respond to that. This was a potato field in County Louth we looked at, a wide range of pHs in the same field, and it was interesting. I went back close to harvest, and the biggest single determinant of yield in that field was the stone fraction. So where we had a lot of stone in certain sections of that field, the P and K results and the pH didn't really impact yield as much as stone fraction did. So again, if you hit a dry year, that's where that part of the field is going to go dry quicker, and you mightn't finish and fill yield, whether it's grass or whether it's crops, potatoes. So again, there's more to it than just the results on a soil test. Again, we'd encourage people go finish with a soil sample, but maybe consider doing a foliar analysis just to see, is the soil sample telling the truth? What's in the soil, is it getting into the plant? And we use a lot of this type of material to help balance nutrients within the plant and help to lead to more increased immunity in the crops, and look at increasing IPM from that point of view. Again, that's old work in 2015. We looked at mycorrhizal seed dressings. Probably what stops a lot of that is that it's not easy. They're not easy sometimes to apply, and farmers are maybe a bit time poor at sowing. But again, what we could show there was a higher response. There was actually the mycorrhiza was pulling more nutrition into the plant. That was taken around growth stage 30 in the growing plant. So again, bigger root mass and more uptake in nutrients. So again, from the same soil with the same soil sample. So again, here's where we try and tell people as well, if you're going to get into it and you want to pooch, you can do one of each of these, and there's loads of labs doing them, but you can actually test your cereals or your forage and see what you've got in it and what you haven't got in it. And then again, okay, my soil test told me I've got this, this, and this. Well, how come it's not ending up in the grain? Sometimes it's because you grow a lot more grain or you grow a lot more grass, but you start to learn little bits and pieces and say, that's interesting. And how do I follow that? Again, this will probably become more important, and especially a lot with the organic people, because they do try and add value, and they're trying, maybe a lot more people trying to sell direct or thinking of that as a process. So how do you add value? Possibly nutrient density, and it's an area that, can be looked at. In the conventional side, we encourage a lot of growers to watch this nitrogen sulfur ratio. We see a lot of disease when nitrogen goes too high and sulfur's not there to balance it out too high. And we don't even agree with those figures on that test. So as I said, sometimes you have to put yourself. We'd like to see that lower, 1 to 10 and below. We've tested a lot of organic crops over the years, and we find a lot of organic crops at 1 to 8. And people say, well, there's no disease in organics, but we think sometimes there's a science behind it, or there's a reason behind it. And again, I just mentioned a local farmer, another fellow colleague in Base, Ireland, Garrett Culligan, and where he'd been using foliar boron for a number of years. And when we started, every 3 years testing the soils that hadn't got boron granules into the soil were starting to exhibit more boron. So those plants were actually translocating boron down through the liquid carbon pathway as well. Very small amounts, but it's amazing what it can trigger in the soil. Organic matter, humus, again, it buffers the soil. Very important. Think people should be looking at this a bit more. Holds on to expensive soluble nutrients, boron and sulfur being two of those. It's a rare win-win situation for the farmer. Every 1% of organic matter, if you study some of the research, it's 15 kilos a hectare of nitrogen, upwards of 25,000 gallons per acre of water. Now, we feel it needs to be active organic matter for that. We're finding a lot of high organic matter soils and they're still struggling in drought. Whereas when we look at old ley that's ploughed and sowed in potatoes, they can hold on to water. And the organic matter is the same as some of the other fields. We're seeing a lot of organic manures on. So definitely there's an active organic matter and there's a biological organic matter as opposed to just straight organic matter. So that's something we'll touch now and shortly. So we look at microbes and earthworms like moisture. They don't like things to go too dry and too hot. So again, soil cover, soil armour, companion crops, understories, can be helpful to keep soil temperatures nice and low and available, or within a range that your soil life can tolerate. Hence, in America, they push hard to keep what they call armour on the soil, and some very interesting examples of temperature between the rows of corn and soybeans with and without the soil armour. Big difference in temperature, in some cases up to 25 degrees Fahrenheit over there. So getting back to Albrecht insoluble yet available, that organic matter will hold those nutrients like that. We're looking at oxygen, hopefully letting in more oxygen. And then talking about, say, water stable aggregates, water stable soil aggregates. We think that has a lot more to give than just a straight organic matter test. So it's something we've been looking at for the last number of years. Looking at soil biology, just a wee trial a student in conjunction with ourselves did out on the Cooley Peninsula 5-6 years ago at this stage, where we looked at actually putting different types of humic and molasses and microbes into the soil. This is a conventional farm that uses fertilizer, but you can see straight away you're feeding soil life, and in that feeding you're increasing root mass. Again, people tend to talk, and I know Gary mentioned this, we'd agree with this at Knots. You can emphasize the fungal structure in the soil a lot, and it will protect soil and it holds soils together. It's a brilliant thing. It tends to increase as we go towards a no-till road. But we also find that it holds things, it holds nutrients, and sometimes that mightn't be exactly what you want. The bacteria will give us a lot more available nitrogen. So if people are trying to grow cash crops, that may be what they need. And again, you don't need to change that fungal bacteria ratio an awful lot. You just need to, definitely closer to 1-to-1 or slightly below 1-to-1. Balancing soil and plants. A lot of people use the example in the barrel with the staves of Van Liebig's law, the minimum, whatever short, you have to fix it. Look, you do if everyone's getting really well paid for the produce and it paid you, and you, especially if you're pushing crops. So we'd find that less and less with organics or regenerative or conservation agriculture or biological farming systems, that are not forcing the crops as much with whether it's organic or non-organic nitrogen. Especially an excess can be as harmful as a deficiency, and Van Liebig in the end did acknowledge the real importance and value of humus on organic matter as opposed to just shortage of nutrients. So we have the synergies and antagonisms. We look at those with Muller's chart in a second. And as I said earlier, what's in the soil sometimes doesn't get into the plant. As a farmer, I think we encourage farmers to just pick your own goals, be comfortable with them. Don't mind what anyone else is saying to you. If you just want to do A, B, and C and leave it at that, and you're happy and your system works, and it's nearly like a little bioeconomy, and you're not taking too much away, and you're still happy and making a living, that's fine. Find your comfort zone and learn to, you can investigate it, you can pooch in it, you can be curious about it. But if it's just working for you, that's fine. Once you understand why it's working for you and what you're doing. And again, we always emphasize, fix those most important basics at the lowest levels. We often use examples of the movies. I don't know whether anyone sort of, I find a lot of the movies, everyone's looking for an advantage. So there was a famous one about the American War of Independence, The Patriot, a number of years ago. Mel Gibson was in it, but he ends up having to go off, and he's too young, two or three young fellas helping him to pick off army regulars. But he tells them before they start shooting, aim low, miss low. So like basically, if you start to take the fancy headshots, there's a high chance you miss. So we'd be the same. If there's no point trying to fix an obscure trace element deficiency and spending a lot of money on it in a field, if actually you need 2 ton of lime, and that would do a lot more for you. So fix those first, and don't let great get in the way of good. And an example we learned and heard from Gary Zimmer first, it doesn't have to be perfect. Once it's doing something for you and you're getting up a couple of steps that you feel you're performing better and the farm's performing better, that's fine. And again, one of his great statements was you have to earn the right. So even in organics, if we want to farm without nitrogen, well then how do we learn to grow our own nitrogen, or make sure that nature provides us with our own nitrogen? And then it's not that it's a struggle to leave it behind, or any of these inputs really. So again, Muller's chart, and you can see some nutrients antagonize with each other and drive each other apart, or an excess of one will lead to a shortage of another, and other nutrients help each other. And again, there's a lot of science and research behind that. Not everywhere, but there's definitely, there's a lot of examples in the past, probably 150 years, of nutrients working well together and helping each other to perform better. So again, you can't manage what you don't measure. I suppose we have to figure out a little bit what should we be measuring. Balance is the real key, and the more intensive the system, as we said, the more measurement and management it's going to need to drive that unfortunately. And I'm using an example of a chemical fertilizer company, Yara. The idea behind this, that when nitrogen prices went to €1,000 a ton, Yara came out with some information to say that if a plant was low in zinc, it was very hard to get to its true and highest nitrogen use efficiency figures. So whether it's heavy input chemical nitrogen or organics, if there's an example of when possibly grass or cereals are short of zinc, that maybe it's not fit to use nitrogen from organics or pick up nitrogen from the soil. So we can learn from the other side if that's the case. Microbes for disease suppression, I'll quickly float through these. Mycorrhiza, we're trying to grow more plant roots and therefore take up more nutrients. Bacillus will help with disease suppression. Trichoderma, the same again, soil disease suppression. Again, more important if somebody's maybe growing veg or the horticultural sectors. Azotobacter, fixing nitrogen. Actinomycetes, lovely earthy smell. We've all smelled that after a nice field. Put the spade into it. P and K solubilizing bacteria does help. We've seen good results with some of these, but again, we'd be encouraging farmers, grow your own and nurture your own, use plants. So there's going to be more restrictions coming across the board, whether it's chemical or organic farmers in the main. And then in the chemical sense, there's a loss of these disease controls. So they're having to look, the chemical section's having to look at this. And that can only be a good thing.
Robbie, I'm sorry to interrupt you now, but just because I know you have a number of slides left, but just to let you know that we're probably gone a little bit over the hour. So just, I don't want to put pressure on, but it would be lovely to have a bit of time for a few questions at the end.
I'll scoot through these last few, Katie. Sorry, apologies. I didn't think it'd take so long, apologies. And again, we encourage farmers to look at microbes purely to help with aeration. So we're very keen to get farmers. So a soil test is a soil test, but if you don't have aeration in that soil, it's probably a false educational tool. So are you feeding your microbes? And again, I think in organics, we just need to grow more diverse plants. So again, this was an example of a cover crop many years ago in Louth. People have heard me spin this story before. Farmer was very unhappy. That was a cover crop. Neighbours were slagging him. What did you do with that shaped crop of oats in Churchtown? But actually what you see here is the first, it's first foray into cover crops. That farmer's now growing a lot of cover crops on an annual basis. In that example, it was a head of potatoes. He said, look, a win-win. I used less steel and less diesel, and it just was a win-win across. But and to show you, we could have a soil test on that piece of soil that's on the left, and it's just a lump of hard soil, and no kindness there. And it'll tell you that it's index 4 P and K, and it'll tell you it's pH of 6.5. Which would you rather have? If that's the same soil beside it, but it's going to behave very differently, and it's going to release those nutrients. You probably could have half the nutrition in the good soil with the open friable structure because of the living roots and the microbiology in it, and probably come out with a better result. So again, we're looking at that carbon sequestration. Carbon and photosynthesis drive these systems, not inputs and fertilizer. They'll grow you a crop, but whether that can be organic farming or manure, it'll grow a crop. But actually, if we're not managing to open up these soils and get them into good heart and health, we're in trouble. And again, we call it the farmer sugar factory. You're just looking at photosynthesis. That's the real important element. It's not free. People say, oh, this is all free. It's not free, but it's low cost. There's nothing free in nature. You have to respect her. You have to give a little back, or you have to prime the pump. You have to put some, and I think that's good for farmers to know that there has to go a little bit in to get it all back. I think people tend to, and that's where some of the people come along with magic products to say, oh, if you put this on, you don't need to do this, this, and this. Nature doesn't work like that. So that's a non-runner. Again, that system, living plants, they're photosynthesizing, they're producing that lovely, sugary syrup, they're sending that down as food down to share with the root system. It's being excreted as root exit. It's feeding the soil microbes and the macrofauna in the soil, and basically that's actually recycling all the nutrients and the goodies in the soil to send back to that plant to send up to grow into grain or food or grass for a farmer to sell. So that's the real bioeconomy. And there's also other health soil health benefits for that, mostly to do with aeration, infiltration, things like that. So again, what's the difference here? A farm, we've been soil sampling for probably 10 to 12 years at this stage, every 3 years, and mostly using a lot of compost. Lovely, index 4, P and K across the board, and then literally 1 or 2 hectare samples pop up. This is trouble areas. We go test them maybe specifically. And what we're looking on the left here is index 2P, and what we're looking on the right is index 4. So in fairness, even if you're in a more push type scenario with crops, that simple Sloan method does work and it'll give results. This was a wee experiment my young fella did. We had American visitors over a good few years ago, and they were listening to him, and it was all about letting the grass grow, the root mass will grow. So now this is what we're seeing in modern day with, we say, mob grazing and what Gabe Brown and the lads talk about. So to be fair, Bud Davis and Rick Bieber were the first people I heard speaking about this, and our own son here, Connor, tried to do a wee experiment where on the right hand side he kept cutting the grass every couple of days, and on the left he just let it grow. And you can see when the grass grew longer, the root mass went down further. So just something. And again, you're feeding microbes and soil life. Avoid compaction if you can. Do whatever you have to do to get rid of compaction. And that's a field to field basis and an annual and a depending on rainfall and previous harvest, etc., etc. Some lovely Scottish research in a chemical environment, but where they had compaction, it was taking twice the amount of nitrogen to grow the crop. It's no different in an organic farm. If we have compaction, that soil is not pumping in the natural zone. So one of the things we like with the organic farmers we work with and soil tests, in the main, if people stop using chemical nitrogen and herbicides and fungicides, soils improve naturally and they behave very differently. And traditional soil tests, to me, don't have as much value. They still have a value, but soils behave different. There's more life in soil, and that creates a life of its own. What I would say is, and it's that living roots that's doing a lot of that, what we would say is if people are in an organic system and they're trying to grow a lot of hay or silage to sell, they could still end up in a position where they need to be making sure they're balancing it, their K inputs, and maybe replacing some of those. So doing nothing isn't always a good option. That's a field of our own here at home called the bogs or the white bogs, and basically it was in schemes for a good few years between continuous meadow that was just being topped and a field beside it for wild bird cover that was being alternated, split every year and tilled and resown an opposite crop either side. And I thought the field that had been done nothing and let grow up really tall and just top the grass and leave it there. And when we went and we started doing digs at the end of the 10-year cycle, you'd actually think somebody had abused the field with the grass that just was allowed grow. So sometimes doing nothing isn't an option, and a bit of tillage can be a real help just to keep that soil moving and friable. Again, airborne numbers, great simple indicator of healthy soils. They're just little factories, fertilizer factories. and they create so much goodness in soil and glues and sticky stuff that bugs love. So, just get a spade, go out and start looking for them and do anything you can to encourage them. Mushroom compost, they love it. Any fibrous material, they love it. Residues from crops, they love it. So, even, the likes of the clovers and the legumes, they tend to like a lot of those type of crops. Phacelias, those type of crops in the mix. UK Field tries to show the benefit of them. You know, again, we like David Purdy's work looking at reduction in bulk density, moving up that cation exchange capacity, which they can do. But it's really the big increase in nutrient availability. So even with some soil-borne diseases, which look, you tend not to get the same pressure in the organic system. Again, looking at the microbes, they're everywhere. So let's be careful with them and encourage them and nurture them. They're all over the plants. They're all over that sort of rhizosphere, or even just that top 2 inches, 3 inches of the soil. Look after those, and then on the stems, the leaves, the whole shebang. This is research work from UCD. We shown this many years ago. It's as pertinent today as it was then. It's just once the multi-species were introduced, animals perform better. Their health system improved. So whether that's organic or conventional, that's a win-win. Cotswold seeds, one of the big innovators we've seen in the Western in Western Europe over the years, and they're to be commended for that. They were way ahead of the game. And you see, they talk about plants for soil fertility, have been doing for a long number of years. At one stage, we could take seed in from them, and it was guaranteed free of weed seeds. They were very much into that. They were on the ball with even that sort of risk at the time. But just ahead of the game. Plenty of other companies following suit now, and a couple of good Irish companies taking up the mantle, thankfully. But when you start to see these people, they're not just looking at plants to I suppose, sit and grow in soil. Nitrogen fixation, good for pollinators. Mycorrhizal fungi encouragement. Protozoa and nematodes, air pumps. They're really looking at what are these plants capable of doing for us. Garrett Culligan, who I mentioned earlier, local farmer, base Ireland. We sampled a lot in conjunction with himself, and he had some lovely data on where buckwheat, as part of the cover crop, was growing, was pulling up the phosphorus. Sunflowers are pulling up magnesium. So if you start mixing these plants together, you can start to draw a lot of this nutrition out of the soil that if you test it on a soil test, it's not there. It's not as available, but the plants can make it available. So if we want to try and get phosphorus cycling in soil, buckwheat's an excellent choice, providing we can manage it. And there's Fiona Brennan and Chagas and Johnston Castle has some lovely research in the last 2 to 3 years looking at multi-species and the change in soil microbiology, in the microbiome underneath the different species and the different plants. Well worth looking that up as well. Building healthy, resilient soils. We can fix degraded soils quietly and quickly. We can build new soil. We've seen that done, especially if we reduce tillage and we keep maybe putting some of that matter back into soil, chopping straw, etc. Or definitely, high density fertility building lays and cover crops. Avoid that compaction. We spoke about that. Avoid distraction. Farmers, maybe being critical of you. Just try it. If it didn't work, chalk it down to experience. Don't spend a fortune. Don't do the whole farm. You won't go too far wrong. That liquid carbon pathway that Christine Jones in Australia championed for a good few years, still championing, a great woman and really on the ball. Plant and sap analysis to verify what you're seeing or thinking you have in your soils. Again, those fibrous manures, living plants, and try to have diversity in everything. Rotation, cover crops. Even I suppose just in it just helps to really give you that difference in soil and seasonality as well. So look, this is Philip Reck, cover crops down in Wexford for the mixed species one. So you're growing your own microbes, you're fixing your own nitrogen, and you're doing a lot with P and K and sequestering carbon. Just an example of cover crops, if we get them right versus getting them wrong, what they can do for us. So we look here an example. It was 2024. We're involved in a project. In some early sown cover crops, summer cover crops, we call them, nearly 40 tonnes per hectare, fresh weight. Dry matters varied over that. But actually on a dry matter basis, we were pulling out upwards on 99 kilos of nitrogen, 22 kilos of phosphorus and 144 kilos of potassium. So what you're looking at there is that's a fertilizer factory. Not all of it's going to be available in the first year or two. And in some cases, depending on what crops you're growing, you want to be just a little bit careful with that. But sometimes this is in the environment and it's in the soil, and providing we don't mine it too hard and keep life going, we can actually So even if you took commercial fertilizer values and that, you're looking at nearly over €300 a hectare. Now, if you look at the late zone cover crops, they barely probably cover the seed. But we all know that. That's been known from day one. Like, anyone I think that's been involved with cover crops. But just to show you that actually these cover crops will release a lot of stuff. One of the interesting things there was boron was low in those soils. And when we tested those cover crops, the boron was very high. If you can believe it, you can probably do it. So don't have any fear about understanding soil tests, folks. You'll accept failures as part of a learning journey. I think you'll do better with the learning. And treat soils, microbes, and environment, and animals and humans with respect and kindness. You won't go too far wrong. Protecting and nourishing biodiversity is way more important than we actually think. The more I've learned, the more questions I have, and I think that's genuine. I'll just made a quick point. Regenerative agriculture. A lot of people giving out at the moment. It's a name, it's a brand, it's a label. Forget about it. Don't get into rows. It's look the key thing I think with regenerative agriculture. One of the really important is your context, and I think that does make sense. Individual farmers are justified in saying, well, this is what I want, and this is where I am at the moment in my life, whether it's with family or land availability or finances. That's your context. Work around that. What suits you in your own farm? There's been 60 years of chemical farming, folks, and nearly nobody was fighting in that system. I just see a little bit of at the moment, maybe regenerative, organic, conventional, or sorry, conservation ag, biological. Probably as groups of people, we have more to gain by working together on it. We're only scratching the surface and keep pushing. Healthy biological soil. So we're going away from that simple soil test of pH, P and K. This is the real business of farming. And these numbers change slightly depending on what research you pull out. We've been using this slide for nearly 20 years. Half a ton of earthworms, 400 kilos of arthropods, acting in mycetes, thousands of miles of mycorrhizal filaments. Look at some of the data on rye, the fine hairs on rye crops. They're just stretching for miles. It's amazing. Ton of fungi. If you look after it, the protozoa, 3/4 of a ton of bacteria. This is the real business of farming, folks. So again, just quickly references that Nature and Properties of Soils is a heavy book. I dip into it. I pull a wee bit out of it. If I want to know something about pH, I can just go to the pages, look up the index. Teaming with Microbes does a series of books from Jeff. Very useful, very helpful. Soil microbiology, EA Paul, a little bit heavy, but some good science in there. The Chagas website, very good. And, Fiona's on the job then. There's Veronica I think she's the soil specialist with them now, replaced Mark. So, there's some great data on that website. Base Ireland itself is worth a look up at. And Acres USA, I think, has probably one of the widest ranges in anywhere on the world. So look, farmers and food producers need to increase their own confidence in their own ability. They do need to accept, and I believe this myself, we as farmers need to accept more responsibility for our own decisions. Definitely trust, but you have to verify. And observation is the key to building knowledge and awareness. Get out with the spade and pooch. But to do that, we need to slow it down a bit and calm it down to truly have a look at it. So Albert wasn't far wrong with looking into nature, and you'll understand everything. So Gora might with Galera. Sorry we ran over a bit, Kitty, there, weren't you?
Not at all, Robbie, and Gaurav Mila Mahagot, freshen. Yeah, thanks a million for that. That definitely, you talked about questions there at the end, and that was so packed full of information. It seems like nobody has given in any questions, but yeah, no, you presented loads of really interesting information there. And I suppose I just kind of maybe just to start a conversation in context that a lot of our audience are probably commercial market gardeners, and they're intensively cropping on relatively small pieces of land compared to tillage with a big variety of crops. And you're talking tunnel growing and field crops. So just kind of like the practicalities of a soil test, like how would you go about it, like what time of year, when you've got that much diversity of cropping, just anything on that, just to kind of start a conversation. We don't have a huge amount of time left, but if anyone else has any questions they'd like to throw into the chat, please do.
I see Jim Cronin on this, so I feel nearly even bad going to suggest that answer those questions, Kitty. But no,
I'm sure Jim will come in on this as well.
Yeah, Jim's more than welcome to sort of a font of information and knowledge. But look, we see this as I don't mean so simple. And we have friends and relations and a couple of customers with tunnels, and we see it crops grow. We're testing soil for tunnels at the moment, and it's off the charts, because it's getting a lot of residues into the soil. There's a lot of top biomass being left behind and thrown back in. Thankfully, what I'm seeing in the last number of years is people are starting to grow a lot more cover crops even within their tunnels, and I think that's playing a big role. What I sort of normally say to people is pull a couple of basic soil tests, maybe one in depth out of a tunnel over the course of a year. But and I know it can be difficult. People can be growing nearly all year round. But all you start to see is, and I think I said this to Jim, I think the second time I met him, the first time I met him, I offered to buy his box of veg he took to use as a demo at the meeting, whatever meeting we were at. But you tend to find sometimes you will get high nitrates in that, because if there's so much juice in the soil and it's been started off maybe mixed up with a bit of compost, it tends to be quite rich. And that's something I think you definitely, if you can age that, age the compost and maybe, make sure it's well composted, it tends to slow down that maybe quicker release nitrogen. But sometimes it's quite hard to do it to balance out what's in the plant. But with regard to soil, you just pull, like if it's not a massive big area, pull a soil sample a couple of times a year and just see things will change. Things will change even with the different plants in that soil. And again, Jim can add to that if he feels like it. But that's what I'd see. And even on our own farm, Kitty, like we pull soils and leaves and we test ivy, we test plants in the field. We just test things to see what's going on, or can we see a wee trend or a wee pattern. And some years we get better results from certain actions than other years, and sometimes that's the weather, and sometimes it's just and thankfully in a lot of cases it's that we don't know. I think there's still, thank be to God, there's a bit of mystery to things, because look, if people could control the weather, we'd all be paying for weather at the moment, and I think that's the downside to that. But no, I think just simple, pull a few soil samples, and there's loads of labs around Ireland. There's probably a lab in Ireland within 30, 40 mile, 50 mile of everyone in the country. So, it's something that's relatively simple, and drop it into a lab and get it tested
Because
and
that's what I
start
was
from
going to
there.
ask.
Yeah.
It came up in last week's, webinar, Andy. Kind of, you could tell he had a little bit of disbelief in the system that you're packing up and digging up beautiful, fresh, alive soil, and you're sending it off in the post, in a bag, and you don't know how long it's going to be sitting around, and So, would your advice to be go as local as possible with labs and?
Yeah. But you see, it's not. I know I didn't see or hear Andy's presentation, and it's not. I wouldn't. It's not that I wouldn't. Yeah, look. By the time soil gets to a lab, it's dried and milled and sieved and in. Like it's not. But again, it's just, and like you'll see, and you'll see people can, you'll get a feel for soil, you'll smell soil, you'll get to know if a soil is high or low pH. So sometimes that test is only a bit of a guidance for you. Do you know what I mean? And like there's a lot of people who are closer to nature and closer to their own crops, and they probably don't need to be, a soil test to them isn't going to be that valuable. But an organic grower that needs to just get a bit more grass growing to make sure that he can beat the drought, ahead of the drought. Little things like that. That's where the soil tests probably do kick in. But it's not, look, the lab, you'll get a result back and it'll give you what we call an inert chemical response. So that's in the soil. Most labs are reasonably accurate. We don't, look, we'd send samples to a number of different labs, but at the end, and we would see oftentimes you will get our sample back and you say that doesn't make sense, and we'd ring them back. So like there can be bits and pieces of error. Sometimes it can be if there's a bit of manual stuff still left in the lab. Like if you can imagine somebody maybe shaking a sample of soil so many times before they're tested, and it's just 5 o'clock on a Friday evening, and they're dreaming of going home to their loved one or going to the cinema that night. Things can change. So like, but at the same time, if you're interested in doing soil samples and you do a couple of years over a few years, you'll get a feel for it, and then very quickly you get a feel for the soil and the land. But yeah, now look, we use a thing called a soil microbiometer. Doesn't measure. We actually have. Who do we get off? Martin Lishman, I think, years ago, where we can do an in-field calcium measurement. So again, if Andy was concerned about, that's probably something that's, if someone want, and they're not expensive to look at. We use the soil microbiometer betimes, but again, we don't we don't fixate on it and we don't make it into a religion. But I think it's just sometimes it's how you want to use the information. And if somebody, if somebody, the closer you are to what you're doing, you probably have a good feel for it. Like if someone's in market gardening and they're growing good crops and the customer feedback is good, well, as far as most people are concerned, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And that's what we'd still see with a lot of the organic growers. They're not forcing things, so you don't tend to get the problems you'll get in more intensive systems, and therefore soil and plant analysis becomes probably less relevant.
I might bring Jim Cronin in at this point. Jim, if you're there and happy to unmute.
Okay. So good evening, Mr. Byrne.
Well, Jim, how are you, boy?
I'm very good. So tell me now, because this could be very relevant to organic growers. What happened with your field was 10 years in eco schemes.
Yeah.
And when you tested your field, there was very little there. So in your opinion, what happened in the 10 years?
From what we could see of it, Jim, we actually stopped soil life, and it probably could have even been that it was, maybe it was only ever mowed once a year. So and we were following the guidelines and the rules, but it was really it was just when I dug that, when I went out to dig that soil, I thought I was going to be looking at. So I think the message that what I took from that was what happened was nothing really happened. So we didn't stimulate. We hadn't animals going out stimulating sort of, eating some grass and shocking the plant, and they put down more roots to grow more, to survive. And in doing that, they open up the soil. That was neither field got any inputs in that 10 years because that was part of the rules. Neither field got lime, neither field got P&K. The field that had the wild bird cover that was alternated I think it was every year, every 2 years, and all that, so it was tilled. Half of that field was tilled. Sorry, I think it was every 2 years, and it could have been linseed, and the other part was, like forage rape or something like that. It was wild bird cover, and we definitely think that the stimulation of that and the fresh, even the rotation, the soil was way more, and both fields would have started off the same. They're side by side actually, a 6-acre field and a 7-acre field. So I just feel we didn't allow soil life to function in that first example.
Yeah. And if a market gardener then was taking over that field from you, what would be your first kind of where would you begin with that market gardener, and just because that field then is not going to grow crops for that market gardener? No. It's too poor. So where would your start points be then?
We had actually so that those two fields were in some sort of scheme for 10, if not 15 years. And I said, look, we'd like to do something with organics. So I said, here's the best, now we have other fields that got no fertilizer or anything. They're down along the river and that, in lovely fields. But these were two fields. I said, here's a great chance to put two fields, get into organic farming. So we're now into our third year. We did 2 years of conversion. It was fully organic since last January, and I decided leave it in fertility building, multi-species for one more year. And funny, if you go out with the spade now, and we've been grazing those crops, you're allowed to bring cattle on or sheep on for so many days, and we've done that. We've taken I think we did take maybe one cut of bales off it in the last 3 years, but mostly it was just grazed and let grow, and then grazed again, quite heavy stocking, and grazed it down. Maybe 2 cuts in the 3 years, but definitely the soils have transformed, Jim. So look, to me, it was put in some sort of a species that could open up the soil and put life into the soil, and that's, I think, what we managed to do with the multi-species. So now our battle plan, please God, this coming spring is spring wheat into that. Hopefully for flour.
Yeah, and do you think you'll have enough fertility to carry the wheat?
I think we will, yeah. Now, I didn't test it. It'll be tested now with the last 3 weeks rain, but it'll be tested soon enough, if not early spring. I going on what I've been seeing, there's loads of life in it. I don't think I don't think it'll need anything. If depending on whether that I'm not looking to force the wheat. you know, so I'd like to play a little with that. And I do find this, like index 2 in organic ground is performing way better than index 2 in conventional. It just
Yeah,
seems there's loads
yeah,
of life.
yeah, yeah.
So,
So you're
and
going to plow and sow.
oh, ploughing, so yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
we've had an understory clover in before under a cereal, so I'll try and do that again. And again, not this year, Mary presented some lovely, you know, data on that as well. We've been following the people and innovative farmers in the UK for a good few years on it, so we're going to try and do something like that as well. But look, it's going to be a learning curve, Jim. But I think the message for me was we left it one more year. We could have done something with it last spring and tried to take a
Mm.
crop out of it. And I said, no, I think I'm going to leave it one more year. I just didn't think that first field was ready. And I said, what's the point? Let's give it another. So I just think with the living plants, and you know, we see these multi-species, they're phenomenal, folks. Have been for years. Like even conventional or organic, they're conventional. They're a phenomenal piece of kit.
Yeah, yeah. But this is my last. Can I say my last comment? Can I say another comment?
You can indeed, Jim.
Yeah. So it has in Robbie, what it has to be said in organics, in intensive market gardening organics, is you continuously spoke about soil health, soil biology, organic matter content, life form in the soil, and it has to be said that flame weeding and the use of MyPex is having a negative impact on all the things that you're aspiring to. Is that not true?
Yeah, anything that we see, anything that's putting a stop to that above ground, whatever you want to do with life, it's having negatives. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I'm
Okay.
not like I wouldn't even take on to say how to get round that, but I definitely see um we just had like how would you say it, trying to cod crops and cod weeds. And I know that's not easy, folks, but like the closest I seen to sort of any success was Randy Anderson in the Dakota Lakes in America, and he was just constantly trying to grow crops to keep on top of weed pressure. And he was now, in fairness, he wasn't market gardening, but he was in a tough environment. And definitely, it's just the more we can do every time we get a chance to grow a crop that's not a weed and get it incorporated into the soil and get away. The only thing I've seen and it was probably in conventional veg where they looked at soluble calcium and humic acid at high dose levels. I did find for whatever reason, and I think the soluble calcium, I think the more I see the soluble calcium, Jim, it definitely has a role. Um, it seems to help plants beat weeds, or it seems to stop weeds, not, I won't say germinating as such, but definitely, and I've seen I've only seen a couple of anecdotal examples of it. So probably we didn't elaborate on it that much because look, we tend to prioritize what we have to spend trials money on. But definitely, I think that soluble calcium at the germination level with the crops and the weeds is something's happening. So I suppose if you look at a lot of weeds, they're opportunistic things and they're able to, you know, like we look at what if we look at wild oats in conventional oats or conventional cereals, every time we tested them over the years, sky high in calcium, way ahead. If we
Mm.
tested conventional farmed oats beside them, there were probably a third to two-thirds less in calcium. So a lot of these weeds, if the plant can't access calcium, the weed sort of grows. And I haven't done enough to tie you with it, but I've seen one or two interesting things with it. So that might be Jim Cronin. You, that's a great innovator. Maybe that's something we could get you looking at. But I do think there's something with the soluble, available calcium. And it doesn't have to be expensive forms or anything like that. You know, it does it. I don't know what crop. How do you sow some of these market gardening crops? Can it be placed? Is it something that can be done as a seed dip? We've seen some very interesting results, especially with brassicas. Now, in fairness, more so like the oilseed rape crops, where we've used seed dressings that have been based around calcium. Now, again, we didn't do enough. It's a market that wouldn't be massive, massive, massive. So I suppose we didn't just get stuck into, but definitely I've seen some interesting things with available calcium. I've seen rape crops that you think got 40 units of nitrogen, and all they got was a calcium-based seed dressing. And will till up quicker, will grow quicker, will push out quicker. And again, sometimes that can help with weed control. So that might be something worth looking at.
Okay.
We'll do something on it, Jim. We'll do.
Yeah.
Looking forward to that, lads.
I'm messing around with it.
Right. Good.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I think there's something in that.
Yeah, I've been using it on I've been using liquid calcium on grassland with great success.
Yeah.
Because I grow a bit of grass for animals as well.
Yeah.
See, I'm always watching. I'm always in the market garden. I'm always watching compaction.
Yeah.
So we're in a bed system, and in the market garden where you have people walking on the beds, you're going to get your calcium will not be available.
Yeah.
Where you get foot traffic on the bed, where you're in between the rows where you're growing the spinach or the beetroot.
Yeah.
Calcium will not be available, and then you'll see calcium deficiency.
Yeah.
But there's plenty of calcium there, but it's not available because
it's not available, and that's the problem we see.
Yeah.
And even go back to grass, like we use a lot of calcium on grass, we use a lot of calcium on cereals, we use a lot of calcium on potatoes, and there's so much. And you even take conventional grass, a lot of potash being thrown at these crops because potash is perceived to give you bulk yield, and it does in theory, but actually it really knocks out calcium from getting into the plant.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, lads, thanks for that. We'll be watching that space. And look, we're going a little bit over time. So Robbie, I've just got one more question from a lady in the audience, and we'll just try and kind of keep it tight and wrap up, because I know people, that it can be hard going after they've been on screens for everybody here. So just one more question, and that's from Margaret, a second-year farmer, first-year organic conversion, farming a small parcel and summer grazing beef on good land with heavyish soil, based the west coast of Sligo, about 1 kilometre from the sea. One field reseeded 5 years ago with ryegrass clover mix. Soil test says low P, low K, buffer pH 6.7. So just wondering, would you recommend reseeding with multi-species sward or no-till and add slurry or humac?
Yeah, we've got great results direct drilling plantain and chicory. We've even got great results scattering. I won't use the term that's used in County Louth, but we scattered chicory seed one year. Me and the kids were very young at the time, and we just for the hell of it. And I suppose whether it was as Jim Cronin said, whether it was us all walking after it and tramping it in a wee bit, but we actually got it. It took. So if that's nice soil and not too stony and hard and dry, like there's lovely small, there's loads of drills, I think, around the country. It's not hard to get a contractor with a disc or a direct drill. And don't go wild with it. Possibly do maybe a small part of a field, or a half a field, or a field, not all the fields, and see does it take. But equally so, I do know people that have scattered some of those crops, which are the key cheaper components of the multi-species. I know we can go more into forbs, and there's definitely a benefit to that, but if you just want to get off the ground, that chicory and plantain is hard to beat, and I can tell you it's transforming soils. Those multi-species are transforming soils physically, biologically and chemically. So yeah, I'd encourage that lady to definitely try and get, but with that, it may not mean that she has to go to the trouble of a full reseed, even though maybe that's that's probably the most secure way of doing it, but it's quite expensive. And I think it could be.
She's wondering, Robbie, spring or autumn sowing?
Oh, look, listen, we ended up sowing multi-species late here because the contractor didn't come when he was supposed to come. And I was afraid of my life they wouldn't grow, and they're growing the finest now. When they were sown really, really late. Sometimes that's just a thing of luck. In the last 6 to 8 months, it was hard to get a proper thing between dry. It was either too dry or too wet. But I think what that lady could do is try and get her hands on a couple of kilos of both those seeds, scatter them, maybe run a wee chain harrow or run a 9 tying harrow. Some of these little seeders just create enough. And then if you got a flat roller in, you might just create enough of a seed to soil contact that they'll grow without compacting it even more. But we've had good success. We've direct drilled peas and beans into grass, and they grew fine. You know, just playing with things. We've direct drilled maize into grass, just looking at trying to get more biomass, a C4 plant in the summertime. We just trick around and mess around with some of those things, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But again, don't go mad. Don't buy 3 ton of seed and do it all the one way the one day. You know, just try little bits and see what happens.
Brilliant. Thanks, Robbie, and thanks, Margaret, from the question. And Robbie, some really good sound all-round information there. So thank you so much for joining us tonight and for sharing all your deep knowledge into all things soil, and it definitely went beyond soil tests. So it was excellent. And just to say, everybody, we've got our in-person conference coming up next week. So this day next week, we'll all be in Kilkenny, and we've got a great range of speakers. And then just on the soil theme, one of our speakers, Brian O'Hara, who is written a few books on no-till market gardening, he is going to join us and do another workshop the day over on the next day on Castle Ruddery Organic Farm. So we're looking forward to meeting lots of you in person. Robbie, if you're around that day, it would be great to have you as well. And I know and you'll be presenting on a panel, and it's going to be a great day. So if anyone hasn't bought a ticket, make sure to do so now. And if you can get another day off farm, it's a good time of year for it. It'll be a great workshop in Castle Ruddery as well. So
Kitty, I had signed up for it. So, and I meant to say, hopefully, if someone had questions tonight, and apologies if I ran on too long, if somebody has questions and they feel that they didn't get them answered, if they pop them on to you, Kitty, I'll come back to you and happily answer any questions that come through. So thanks again for the opportunity, and I enjoyed it.
Brilliant, Robbie, and loads of lovely positive feedback coming back. So brilliant, and thanks for everyone for logging on and joining us tonight. I'm sure you had lots of other things you'd like to be doing, so fair play. Okay, thanks folks, have a lovely rest of the evening.
Bye. Long.